If you're anything like me and most human beings on planet Earth, you probably occasionally get in arguments with people. Hopefully you keep those arguments civil, calmly discussing the reasons why you are right and giving evidence to back up your side, which is basically what we do in argumentative writing. Arguments and debates like this are an everyday part of life. Think of doctors weighing the pros and cons of a different method of treatment, or lawyers in a courtroom, or you arguing with a friend over which restaurant has the best calzone and why calzones are the most superior of all foods. Debates should stay civil. When you keep things relaxed, you're usually able to come to some type of agreement more easily. It really helps when you can see both sides of an issue. You don't necessarily have to agree with the other side. But if you take into account how the other person is feeling and why they might take that position, it allows you to better understand why they are taking the side that they are taking. This in turn not only makes you a less annoying person, and much more mature than an angry Facebook baby all caps screaming into the void about something that they don't understand, it sets you up to win your argument. That's right, taking a moment to consider the other side first sets you up for success. And it does this through something called the counterclaim. Your teacher may also call this the counterargument, but it's what we're going to be focusing our lesson on today. It's called the counterclaim. Note number 1 states, the counterclaim is when you briefly describe the opposing view's position and then explain why your side is better. By acknowledging that the other side has at least some truth to it, but then coming back to knock down what the other side is saying, you weaken their argument significantly. Let's quickly move on to note number 2. Note number 2 says that the counterclaim serves to weaken the other side. You may show why their points are wrong over the course of your counterclaim. Let's look at an example of this real quick. And up on the screen you should see an example from the cell phone debate that we've been looking at the last few days. In this example, the author begins their counterclaim or their counterargument here. They state that there are good reasons for the cell phone ban, such as students using them to cheat on tests and that they could lead to fights and things. But, and it's a big but, they then come back and say after that, but cheating, fighting, and truancy have been going on for much longer than students have had cell phones. Kids will always find a way to communicate these things. They predicted what the opposing side would say, and then they directly confronted it. This portion of their counterclaim, highlighted in blue, is often called the rebuttal, or the turnback, depending on what your teacher or your professor calls it. Note number 3 says that the rebuttal, or the turnback, is the part where you directly state why the opposing side's points are wrong. Let's look at another example. This time, check out this whole essay. The topic being on whether metal bats should be banned in baseball. We looked at it a couple videos ago. Pause the video here and skim this again really quick and see if you can pick out the counterclaim from it. If you picked it out as right about here, then you're correct in your selection of where the counterclaim is. See how their arguments worked, or how their counterarguments worked rather. They state that some people claim, to set that up, that this is what the other side might say. They acknowledge that the cost of these bats is higher, but then directly counter it by saying that the safety is worth the cost, which is a really good argument. Most people are going to say safety is important. This brings us to the next point. Note number 4 says, use an effective transition when opening up your counterargument. So for example, the one we just looked at said, some people claim, as their transition to bring you into the counterargument. This is probably the most common transition I see of people opening up their counterargument. They could have used others like, one might object that wooden bats are too expensive. They might have said, at first glance, you may say that wooden bats are too expensive, or they may say, it might seem that wooden bats would be too expensive, etc., etc. These are all transitions to bring you into the counterargument and let you know that it's beginning. Note number 5 says, you also want to use an effective transition word when doing your turn back or your rebuttal. Remember that your turn back or your rebuttal is where you are directly going against what the other side believes. In their example, they used even so as their transition to bring you into the rebuttal. You could use ones like, nevertheless, a higher cost shouldn't matter when safety is involved. Or, still, a higher cost shouldn't matter when safety is involved. Or another example, despite this, a higher cost shouldn't matter when safety is involved. And there's tons of other transitions you can use to bring it into it, but these set apart the fact that you're coming into a counter argument and that you're setting up your rebuttal. These transition words help to illustrate your point to your audience and also keep your writing flowing. This chart kind of sets it up and shows it well, connecting the 2 points to keep things clear. It says, be sure to use the counterclaim transition words and phrases in pairs. Use one to introduce the counterclaim and another to introduce the turnback or your rebuttal. So, examples. It might seem that blank, except turnback. It is true that, your counterargument. Nevertheless, this is the reality. Some people claim, or some people might claim, this opposing side. However, here's the actual correct answer. So last but not least on this, keep in mind that most teachers and professors will say that the counterclaim discussion can be included anywhere in the argumentative essay, though most will agree that it shouldn't happen during the conclusion to your paper. At that point, you should have everything set up and completed. Many teachers and professors will agree that the sweet spot is usually between the body and the conclusion paragraphs, although it might just be a matter of opinion. Right before you wrap things up and prevent your final view in the conclusion, you can pop in this counter argument. Let's look at a snapshot example of that in action, with our first piece being the one on cell phones. So, looking at this again, the author popped it right onto the end of their third body paragraph. In our baseball bat example, they put it as its own small paragraph right after the 3 body paragraphs. Either works, and I encourage my students to either include it at the end of body paragraph 3 or to make it its own paragraph. Most student examples I see seem to have a clearer discussion of the counterclaim when it stands alone as its own paragraph, as I think this just makes it easier for students to organize and for teachers and professors to actually point out and say, oh, here's the student's counterclaim. But it's up to you. Again, listen to what your teacher or professor says, but in my case, I encourage my students to either make their own paragraph near the end of their essay or to pop it in at the end of body paragraph 3. That's really all I've got today on the counterclaim or counterargument. Despite the fact that this is coming almost last before our conclusion, the counterclaim and counterargument are probably the second most important part of any argumentative essay. Your introduction has to be incredibly strong and set things up, but if you don't predict what the opposition is going to say, then you weaken your overall argument as a whole. I hope this was helpful, and have an excellent day.